While world leaders debate ceasefires that never materialize, while Israel and Iran exchange strikes that analysts call a contained conflict, and while Russia and the West edge closer to a line no one wants to cross, a book written in the 6th century, before Christ, had already described this state of permanent instability as the exact condition that precedes the rise of the Antichrist. Not as metaphor, as sequence, Daniel 8 is perhaps the most specific, most verifiable, and most ignored out chapter of biblical prophecy. And what it says about what comes next is what this video will reveal. It begins on an afternoon. The year is 551 before Christ. The city of Susa, in what is today southwestern Iran, is not yet the capital of anything significant at that moment. It is a city in the region of Elam, on the banks of the Ulai River, in a part of the world that few outside the region could locate on a map. A man named Daniel is there, not as a tourist, not as a career diplomat chosen on merit, but as an exile. Someone who was torn from Jerusalem as a teenager, when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon swept through the city for the first time and took with him a selection of young men from the Jewish nobility, the most intelligent, the most promising, those who could be trained to serve the empire that had destroyed their homeland. Daniel was over 60 years old that afternoon in Susa. He had survived 3 Babylonian kings, the fall of Babylon itself to the Medo-Persian Empire, and was now serving the new dominant power. He had interpreted impossible dreams that no court magician could decipher. He had read a writing that appeared on a wall during King Belshazzar's banquet, 3 words in Aramaic that announced the fall of the Babylonian Empire that very same night. He had survived a lion's den for refusing to stop his daily prayers. Daniel was not a man of occasional visions. He was someone with a verifiable track record of prophetic perception, and what came to him that afternoon in Susa was unlike anything he had experienced before. It was not a vague dream full of generic symbolism. It was a vision with the precision of an intelligence report. Daniel described what he saw with a specificity that, in and of itself, should give pause to anyone reading it for the first time. He was standing on the banks of the Ulai River when he spotted a ram standing there. Not just any ram, an animal with 2 horns of different heights, the taller horn having grown up last. The ram began to move. It charged toward the west with a force that no other creature could withstand. It charged to the north. It charged to the south. It did as it pleased, it grew, it became ever more imposing. No army came close, no power resisted. The identification of this symbol requires no sophisticated theological interpretation. The text itself, a few verses later in chapter 8, provides the answer directly. The angel Gabriel appears before Daniel and declares, "The ram with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The smaller horn is the Median kingdom. The larger horn, which grew up afterward and surpassed the first, is the Persian." And here, the historical precision of the vision begins to become unsettling. The Persian Empire did not simply defeat Babylon. It absorbed and then completely subjugated its Median coalition partner, exactly as the larger horn grows and dominates the smaller. Cyrus the Great unified Persians and Medes under his command, but the Persians were clearly the dominant force. The empire that resulted from that unification stretched from Egypt to the border of India. More than 7 million square kilometers under a single administrative system, with a royal road network that allowed messages to cross the continent in less than a week, with a multilingual bureaucracy that administered populations from dozens of distinct cultures, and with an army that some estimates place at 2 million combatants at peak capacity. The ram that charged westward, northward, and southward, with no beast able to resist it, is an image any military historian would recognize as accurate. And then, from the opposite end of the vision's horizon, the goat appears. It comes from the west. That is the first geographically relevant detail. It comes with a speed that Daniel's text describes in a way that would seem exaggerated if it did not correspond exactly to historical reality. The goat did not even touch the ground. This image, a war animal moving with such speed that it seems to fly, is not accidentally poetic. It is the most precise possible representation within the symbolic vocabulary available to Daniel of a military campaign that operated at a speed no general in the ancient world had dared to calculate as achievable. The goat had a single prominent horn between its eyes, singular, dominant, unmistakable, and it went straight for the Persian ram with a ferocity that Daniel describes as absolute fury. It attacked the ram, broke both its horns, threw the animal to the ground, trampled it. No force in the field could help the ram. The goat became exceedingly powerful. The identification, again, is in the text itself. The goat is the king of Greece. The large horn is the first king, Alexander, son of Philip II of Macedon. He was 22 years old when he crossed the Hellespont in 334 before Christ. The army he took with him was composed of approximately 43,000 infantry soldiers and 5,000 cavalry, a force that Persian strategists calculated as insufficient for any serious confrontation with the greatest empire on earth. The Persian Empire had more than 1 million combatants distributed across its continental expanse. Alexander's treasurer warned that they had provisions for only 30 days. Some generals recommended waiting, consolidating resources, planning carefully. Alexander crossed anyway. What followed was the most astonishing military sequence of the ancient world. In 334, the Battle of the Granicus opened all of Anatolia, what is today Turkey, in weeks. In 333, the Battle of Issus put the Persian king Darius III himself to flight, leaving behind not only the battlefield, but his entire family, mother, wife, daughters, whom Alexander captured and treated with calculated respect as a political gesture. In 331, the Battle of Gaugamela in Mesopotamia destroyed the last significant army the Persian Empire managed to assemble. Darius fled again and was assassinated shortly afterward by his own generals, who attempted to negotiate with Alexander by delivering the king's corpse. Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the greatest empire the world had ever known. A city of palaces that had taken decades to build, filled with treasures accumulated over 5 generations of kings in 330 before Christ. He was 25 years old. 11 years of continuous campaigns, 0 recorded defeats, a domain stretching from Macedonia to what is today Pakistan. The goat that flew without touching the ground is, in all likelihood, the most economical and most precise description ever written to summarize Alexander the Great's military campaign, written more than 200 years before it happened. But this is where Daniel's vision begins to reveal something that goes beyond historical confirmation. Because what happens to the goat after the victory is not continued expansion. It is sudden collapse at the absolute peak of power. When the goat was at the height of its dominion, that is the exact moment the text specifies, the large horn was broken. And in place of that single dominant horn, 4 prominent horns grew up, pointing toward the 4 winds of heaven. Alexander died in Babylon in the year 323 before Christ. He was 32 years old. The exact cause of his death is still debated by historians and physicians who study the ancient accounts. Typhoid fever contracted from the contaminated water of the Euphrates River, arsenic poisoning gradually administered by political rivals, complications aggravated by years of battle wounds. A spear had pierced his lung at Gaugamela, an arrow had struck his chest in Indian territory, or simply the collapse of a body that had been subjected to extraordinary physical exertion for more than a decade accelerated by the excessive alcohol consumption that contemporary accounts describe as increasingly prevalent in his final years. What is known with certainty is that there was no prepared heir. His son with Roxana was born months after his death. When his assembled generals asked to whom the kingdom would go, Alexander, in his final condition, is said to have replied, "To the strongest." What followed were 40 years of internal wars, the so-called Wars of the Diadochi, the successors that consumed more lives and resources than many of Alexander's original conquests. At the end of that period, the vast unified territory had been divided into 4 main fragments. Cassander took Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus seized Thrace and much of Asia Minor. Seleucus kept Babylon, Syria, and the eastern core of the conquered Persian territory. Ptolemy controlled Egypt and Cyrenaica. 4 horns, 4 directions, written by Daniel more than 2 centuries before it occurred, with enough precision that the historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century after Christ, documented that Alexander had allegedly read the book of Daniel upon arriving in Jerusalem and recognized himself in the prophecies. But the text does not stop at the 4 horns, because what emerges next is what the book of Daniel considers the central element of the entire vision. And it is also the element that makes chapter 8 relevant, not merely as an exercise in historical archaeology, but as a lens for analyzing the present. From one of the 4 horns emerges something that starts small, a horn that initially seems insignificant, but it grows. It grows toward the south, it grows toward the east, and it grows toward what the text calls the glorious land, an expression that in biblical Hebrew vocabulary refers specifically to the territory of Israel. The little horn grows until it reaches the host of heaven. It casts some of the stars to the ground. It tramples on them. It exalts itself as high as the prince of the host. It removes the daily sacrifice from the place of the sanctuary. The place of the sanctuary is desecrated. Truth is cast to the ground, and the figure acts successfully, prospering in everything it does. Daniel then hears a heavenly being ask another, "How long will the vision last?" The answer, 2,300 evenings and mornings, after which the sanctuary will be cleansed. Most analyses of Daniel 8 divide here into 2 distinct readings. Both need to be presented honestly, because both carry genuine historical weight. And the tension between them is precisely what makes this chapter so disturbing. The first reading, the historical one, supported by an extensive line of historians and commentators, points to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, who ruled from 175 to 164 before Christ. Antiochus was a direct descendant of Seleucus, one of the 4 generals who divided Alexander's empire. He therefore emerged literally from one of the 4 horns, from the Seleucid lineage that controlled Syria and the ancient Middle East. His rise to power already bore the marks of the pattern Daniel had described. He was not the obvious heir to the Seleucid throne. He was the 3rd son of Antiochus III, had spent more than a decade as a political hostage in Rome after the Treaty of Apamea, and came to power through a lateral route, using intrigue, temporary alliances, and the convenient death of a brother, a man skilled in intrigue, as the text of Daniel describes. His geopolitical campaigns follow the pattern of the vision with a precision that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. He expanded his domain southward, attacking Egypt on 2 occasions. On the second campaign, he came so close to conquering Alexandria that Rome needed to intervene directly, sending an ambassador who drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and demanded that he make his decision before stepping out of it. Humiliated, Antiochus withdrew. He advanced eastward in campaigns against Persia, and then he turned his attention to the glorious land, Israel, which was under his administrative control as part of the Seleucid kingdom. What he did there is considered, by Jewish and Christian historians alike, as one of the most deliberate and systematic desecrations any ruler ever carried out against a religious practice in ancient history. In 167 before Christ, Antiochus entered Jerusalem with military force. The second book of Maccabees documents that approximately 80,000 people were killed or enslaved. Judaism was banned under penalty of death. Circumcision, Sabbath observance, and possession of copies of the scriptures became crimes punishable by immediate execution. Women who circumcised their sons were killed with their babies hung around their necks. An imperial decree transformed the Temple of Jerusalem into a place of worship for Zeus Olympius. A pagan altar was erected over the altar of burnt offering. A pig was sacrificed on that altar, and its broth was poured over the holy place. The desecration was so calculated, so explicitly designed to destroy the religious identity of a people, that the text of Daniel calls it the abomination that causes desolation, an expression that Jesus quotes in Matthew 24 as a reference to a future event, not the past, opening the possibility that the pattern of Antiochus is a prefiguration of what is still to come. The very name Antiochus used for himself carried the dimension of his hubris. Epiphanies means God manifest, the claim that divinity had manifested in him, through him. The Jews who survived his reign called him by another name, Epiphanies, the madman. The Maccabean revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, began in the villages of Judea with a few hundred fighters without formal training, fighting against one of the finest professional armies of the ancient world. 3 years later, in 164 before Christ, Judas Maccabeus entered Jerusalem, recaptured the temple, and ordered its purification and rededication. The festival of Hanukkah, 8 days of lights that Judaism celebrates to this day, commemorates that moment. Antiochus died the same year, far from Jerusalem, overtaken by illness and what some sources describe as psychological collapse after attempting to plunder a temple in Persia and being repelled. The 2,300 evenings and mornings fit within certain chronological interpretations. The period between Antiochus's suspension of the daily sacrifice and the restoration of the temple by the Maccabees, approximately 6.5 years of continuous desecration. The precision is close enough for the historical reading to be taken seriously by any honest analysis. But it is insufficient to resolve the central problem that the text itself raises, and which completely changes what you are observing in the world today. The angel Gabriel, while interpreting the vision to Daniel, repeats a phrase that cannot be ignored or minimized. He repeats it not once, but twice, with variations that reinforce the same message. Understand, Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And then, a few sentences later, here is what will happen in the last period of wrath, because it concerns the appointed time of the end. Antiochus Epiphanes died in 163 before Christ. It was the 2nd century before Christ. It was not the end of history. It was a brutal and specific chapter of a historical period that passed and was documented. The angel Gabriel, in saying time of the end, was not describing Antiochus as the final event. He was using him as a pattern, as a structural model, as the form the phenomenon takes when it manifests on a partial scale before its complete manifestation. That distinction is the heart of everything that follows. The text of Daniel 8, in verses 23 through 25, describes the characteristics of the final king with a specificity that goes beyond any historical figure that has ever existed. And an honest reading of those characteristics requires you to look at each one separately, because each of them corresponds to patterns the world is relearning to recognize in real time. In the latter part of their reign, when the transgressors have reached the full measure of their sin, a king of fierce countenance, skilled in intrigue, shall arise. The phrase, when the transgressors have reached the full measure, is especially precise. It is not when evil simply exists. Evil has always existed. It is when evil reaches the point of saturation, when the international system of norms, agreements, and enforced limits exhausts its capacity to contain what is expanding. The world of 2026 is testing exactly that exhaustion. Multilateral agreements that functioned for decades are being unilaterally discarded. Rules of war that international law had established as minimum limits are being systematically violated, documented in real time by satellites and mobile phone cameras, with no real consequence following the documentation. The system of international order built after the Second World War is cracking at multiple points simultaneously, and not because a single actor is destroying it, but because the consensus that held it together has vanished. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. This is one of the most unsettling phrases in the text, because it implies that the final figure's power will come from a source external to his own natural competence. It is not someone who builds an empire through the force of administrative talent, military skill, or personal charisma. Though those characteristics may be present, it is someone who is empowered by something beyond himself. The text does not specify the nature of that empowerment, but the historical pattern of Antiochus being empowered by the circumstances of Seleucid collapse suggests that the systemic fragility of the historical moment is part of the mechanism of ascent. He shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does. These two elements together create a disturbing image: destruction that works, that achieves its objectives, that does not fail in its execution. Most historical tyrants end in defeat and visible collapse. The text is describing something different: a figure whose destructiveness is efficient, who does not stumble into the common errors of those who abuse power, because the errors are corrected before they become fatal to the project. He shall destroy the mighty men and the people who are the saints. The two targets are distinct: established power structures and a specific population identified as saints, a term that in biblical Hebrew vocabulary refers to the people who maintain a covenant relationship with God. The combination of these two targets suggests that the final figure does not operate solely within the categories of conventional political rivalry. His project is broader: to destabilize existing power systems and eliminate those who maintain a specific identity grounded in something beyond loyalty to temporal power. By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. Deception as state policy. Not as an exception, not as an emergency resource, as standard method. The text is describing a system where information is instrumentalized, where narrative is controlled, where what populations believe to be true is managed as a strategic resource. It is not difficult to recognize the contours of that description in any analysis of contemporary geopolitics. Without warning, he shall destroy many who are at peace. This specific phrase, he shall destroy those who are at peace, implies that the instrument of destruction will be precisely the sense of security. Peace agreements that create conditions for the next attack, treaties that function as strategies of access, truces that buy time for rearmament. The pattern of using peace as a weapon is as old as war itself. But the text suggests that in its final manifestation, it will be executed on a scale and with an efficiency that will make surprise not merely possible, but calculatedly guaranteed. He shall even rise up against the Prince of Princes, Antiochus. Here the text moves entirely outside the domain of comparative politics and enters an assertion that has no verifiable historical analog. No king, no emperor, No dictator in recorded history has explicitly risen against what biblical prophetic vocabulary identifies as the Prince of Princes, a title used in prophetic context to designate an authority that operates outside human categories of power. It is the point at which the historical political analysis of prophecy reaches its limit and confronts something that can only be evaluated within an eschatological framework. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The end of the figure is not military defeat, it is not a coup, it is not an international tribunal. It is rupture by a force that operates outside human categories of intervention. And here, the text closes the cycle it had opened. Just as the ram was destroyed by the goat and the goat had its horn broken with no hand able to help it, the final horn is broken by something that enters no conventional equation of power. Examine what the current geopolitical landscape is producing in light of this pattern, because the correspondence is not forced. It is present in the very structure of events. The world of 2026 is not a world of stable empires confronting other stable empires. It is a world of accelerated fragmentation. The unipolar order the United States established after the end of the Cold War showed its first cracks with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when the dominant power discovered that military force does not automatically convert into political order. It showed deeper fractures in the financial crisis of 2008, when the economic model underpinning hegemony was exposed as more fragile than its projections had suggested. And it is now under pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The war in Ukraine, the conflict between Israel and its neighbors, tensions in the Taiwan Strait, the realignment of powers that the post-war alliance system had kept in a predictable order. The Russia that invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 is a state that explicitly abandoned the norms of the international order, not because those norms ceased to exist formally, but because it calculated that the cost of violating them was lower than the cost of being contained by them. That calculation, right or wrong, represents a phase shift in the international system. Once a nuclear power demonstrates that norms are negotiable, the incentive for other powers to make the same calculation increases exponentially. Israel and Iran, the direct geographic heir of the ancient Persian Empire, situated exactly in the region where Daniel had his vision, on the banks of what are today the rivers of southwestern Iran, are engaged in a conflict that goes beyond conventional regional rivalry. Iran is closer to real nuclear capability than at any prior point in its modern history. Israel bombed Tehran in June of 2025. Syria, which was the heart of the Seleucid Empire from which Antiochus Epiphanes emerged, went through a civil war that completely destroyed its state structures and turned its territory into a space of competing influences without real sovereignty. Iraq, which was the Babylon where Daniel lived, worked, and wrote his prophecies, is a state divided between Iranian, American, and local militia influences that operate as parallel powers alongside the formal government. The land that Daniel called the Glorious Land is at the center of a conflict that has no visible diplomatic solution on the horizon. The Israeli-Palestinian peace plan, signed in October of 2025, remains stalled in its first phase. The negotiations that should have advanced toward a structural resolution had produced by March of 2026 only deadlock. The pattern Daniel identified is not the pattern of a specific religion or a particular civilization. It is the pattern of how power functions when it reaches certain stages of concentration and collapse. Every major attempt at total dominion in history followed the same structural sequence: a dominant power that expands to its natural limits, the fragmentation that follows its collapse, the power vacuum that fragmentation creates, and the figure who emerges from that vacuum, presenting itself as the solution to the chaos the system itself produced. Persia followed that pattern. Greece followed it. Rome followed the same pattern on a broader continental scale. The 20th century produced two variants of the pattern in two world wars. What Daniel described is not an exception to the pattern. It is, according to the text, the final version of it, the iteration in which the concentration of power reaches an amplitude that previous versions only prefigured, and in which the final interruption does not come from within the system of human rivalries, but from a source exterior to that system. What every great empire promised was the same thing. Alexander promised a universal civilization where Greeks and barbarians would live under a common culture. Rome promised a permanent peace administered by law and army. The British Empire promised order and progress carried to the extremities of the map. The Soviet project promised material equality achieved through the transformation of history. Each collapsed. Each collapse left fragmentation, vacuum, and the exact conditions for the cycle to begin again in a different configuration. Daniel was not describing something unique and incomprehensible. He was describing the climax of a pattern that history repeats with variations, and identifying the characteristics that allow one to recognize when the final climax, and not merely another repetition, is drawing near. The prophecy of Daniel 8 is not an apocalyptic warning designed to paralyze. It is an intelligence document about how power functions, how it erodes the institutions it promised to serve, how political fragmentation creates the exact conditions for extraordinarily dangerous figures to emerge, presenting themselves as solutions, and what happens when that concentration reaches its definitive historical limit. The parts already fulfilled, the Persian ram, the Macedonian goat, the four horns of Alexander's generals, the little horn of Antiochus epiphanies, were confirmed with a precision that led 19th century skeptics to argue that the book of Daniel must have been written after the fact, because no prediction could be that specific. The central problem with that theory is that it resolves the question of the fulfilled parts at the cost of completely ignoring what the text says about what is still to be fulfilled. And the angel Gabriel is explicit in placing the climax of the vision not in the 2nd century before Christ, but in the time of the end. No king in history fulfills all the criteria described in verses 23 through 25 of Daniel 8. None was broken without human intervention. None rose up specifically against what the text calls the Prince of Princes. The text remains open, and texts that are precise in the parts already verified exert considerable intellectual pressure on the parts that still await verification. Ignoring the pattern, when the pattern is drawing itself in the daily news with a correspondence that does not need to be forced in order to be perceived, requires a deliberate effort of disregard that is, in itself, a conscious choice. What you do with what you have just read is up to you, but Daniel asked to understand what he had seen, and the text says that he fainted, was sick for several days, and was appalled by the vision. A man who had interpreted impossible dreams, survived lions' dens, and read writings on palace walls. He was appalled. The question is not whether the vision is disturbing. The question is what you will do with the fact that it corresponds, piece by piece, to the world in which you are living right now.